So I'd like to start with, let's say, a more personal question. You were originally a physicist that, got interested, did work in network science and data science and political science and economics and so on. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your personal trajectory and how you got interested in all these different problems and how you got interested in doing this kind of interdisciplinary research.
Thanks. So at the end of the day, I think like what I'm interested in is how societies become smarter. And I think there's a lot of ways to look at that problem. So on the one hand, I've done a lot of work on economic complexity, and I continue doing work on that area. And that's about understanding the ability of societies to do things in a context that is related to economic geography. So it's how like the geographic distribution of our ability to do things tells us things about, where that knowledge is located, and I think that has been, an interesting area of research. But from there, I also became interested on creating, tools such as the data visualization tools that I then continue doing with Datawheel. And I became interested on how technologies impact the ability of people to make decisions. Anyway, so I became interested on producing technology and on how technology can help make societies smarter. And as digital technologies progressed, and I started to work on this area, I also saw that there were some people that were looking at, for example, the effects of AI in society, but they were doing it in a way that was, to me, a little bit incomplete, because they were looking at AI, comparing it with, what they expect a perfect outcome would be, and then they were judging the AI, whether they got things perfect or not in the context of learning and improving, which is the context that I like to see. I like to see things that are always imperfect, always improvable, and that improvement is what is interesting. So as a reaction to that, I said, well, sure, AI make mistakes, but people make mistakes too. And all of these people that are looking at AI mistakes have not compared, their reactions to how they would react to a human that makes the same mistake. And I think that comparison is important, because if we judge AIs unfairly, we're either gonna adopt them too quickly when we don't have to, or fail to adopt them when they're actually improving, outcomes. And that's how I got interested in it. So it was from understanding how societies become smarter to eventually then understanding, how technology can affect the ability of societies to become smarter.
Mm-hmm. Well, nowadays there is this growing interest of network research in let's say human science, right? What is called digital humanities, and there are so many problems which can be addressed there. So I was wondering what's next for you in that sense. Are you following this? There is the recent book by Neil Ferguson on the Square and the Tower, and other books that go in that direction of looking at history from a network perspective and so on. So I was wondering what are the new topics that you were interested in and you see yourself moving to?
Yeah, I do think that it's really interesting that with the ability now that we have to generate new data sets by parsing text and by looking at non-structured forms of data, like people have been able to collect new data sets that allow us to look at this big history type of ideas. And I'm fascinated by that. I think there's a lot of interesting things when people look at like different economic cycles. For instance, recently I was in a conference last week virtually at UNC, and it was an economic geography and innovation conference. And there was a very interesting paper that, for example, looked at how tacit knowledge was and how tacitness concentrated and dispersed. So it was trying to explain cycles of inequality based on periods in which tacit knowledge, would grow and would become localized, and then, knowledge would get codified and would disperse. And this was all done, by developing metrics using natural language processing on patent data and stuff like that. So I do like those things. Myself, we've done a lot of work, on biographies in Wikipedia in the Pantheon project, and I think there's a very rich view of history that you can get through this type of tools. So I'm definitely fascinated by that, and I would like to continue to contribute as much as I can with my limited team and resources, to those efforts. but I think there's a lot to learn about like cycles and patterns in history, and it's helping us transform a lot of hypotheses that we might have into things that are more quantitative, more testable, and it helps intersect not only people from physics and data science backgrounds, but also like people from anthropology, people from like different fields are coming together in a very interesting intersection that I don't know if it would have been possible without this tool and this data.
Yes, absolutely. Most of the research I see in network science is take networks as networks of individuals, right? So something which is of interest to this community as well is networks of concepts. These huge knowledge graphs. You have things like WordNet or the Psych project or linked data and so on. So I was wondering if you did some research on that, on the analysis of conceptual networks or networks of concepts, and if the general aspects that you find in networks of individuals can be found there as well. Like, for example, this long tail phenomena that you see in networks of individuals, if you would expect to find that in networks of concepts as well.
I haven't done research myself, but I do know of some research on that space, So I think there's two things that come to mind. First, there was the work of Henry Lieberman that he built kind of like networks of concepts based on common sense. So basically one of the things that he was working on was that at the end of the day, like one of the things that people have that machines lack was a lot of common sense. So the fact that like water goes inside the glass, and all of these little rules that we know because we learn as a child and they're very easy for us to learn. And there's tens of thousands of them were things that machine, struggle with, so that's why they kind of like look so stupid. And he collected a lot of common sense statements through crowdsourcing. And then he would decompose this using, principal component or singular value decomposition, these type of techniques. And one thing that I remember he showed me once that to me, I think is very insightful was that we say, okay, so imagine we grab all of these concepts, light, cast, shadow, whatever, and then we take the first component. What is the number one principal component of that? Like the vector that explains most of the variance, that divides the space, the best. And so I don't know. And then I said, okay, it's good or bad. And that to me was very interesting because in some way, I took that lesson with me because it's a little bit of a failing that we have, but when push comes to shove and we're out of words or we don't understand something, we don't talk about taller and shorter, no, we talk about like the good or bad, and we tend to make that mistake of calling things in those terms very, I think, is tacitly, intuitively, it's kind of like a reflex, and it appeared there in that network of concepts. But I think it speaks a lot to like maybe some of the problems that we're seeing right now, that we tend to over moralize things, because it's not the camera, that has better resolution or worse resolution. You see, I'm already saying it, that better and worse. It's like the good camera and the bad camera, or the good refrigerator and the bad. Like we over moralize things because we tend to say good and bad, for things. That's one thing. On the long tail, yes, like so the way that concepts grow as people develop a language is that, for instance, at the beginning, like kids would know bird, and then as you become older, you say, okay, there is a pigeon, and there is a sparrow, and there is a seagull. And so you take concepts and then you start growing them into more specifics. And that is a form of preferential attachment that makes sure that these word associations tend to also have a power law behavior. So there has been work done on that too. Yeah.
It's interesting that, in Italian, people mix up this ethical judgment with aesthetic judgment as well, right? So Italians would say that something is beautiful or ugly when meaning good or bad. So it's almost if you only have aesthetics and mixed with ethics. But there is one interesting point that I mentioned about common sense. I was wondering that what's your opinion about the following? Because it seems to me that a lot of the discussion nowadays on AI is in the end a discussion between, let's say, nativism versus empiricism, right? So it's we are reenacting this centuries-old discussion on what is to be learned or encoded, hardwired as rules and commonsensical rules, or if everything can be learned. And I was wondering what's your opinion on that, and if you place yourself in any of these two camps.
No, for me, like, honestly, like, I'm trained as a natural scientist, so I think the first thing for me is admitting that you don't know, is ignorance, so I do believe, of course, that normative ethics is important. At the end of the day, someone has to, like, come up with a judgment and figure out if something is correct or incorrect. But I don't think that normative ethics should live in a vacuum where there's no positive or empirical look at the ethics, because you're not looking at the empirical side of ethics as a guide for judgment, even though people tend to do what other people do, and and that's not a normative way of getting to morals, but it's kind of like a way for people to say, hey, everybody else is doing it, and that's an argument that is used more often than maybe we would want. But because the empirical ethics might give you kind of an understanding of human psychology, of how people perceive others, that at the end should inform the way that we think about normative ethics as well. So I do believe that like, theory always has to be in dialogue with experiments, and in philosophy, the experimental side in some way has been a little bit neglected in comparison to in the natural and the social sciences. So I would say the way that I can contribute is by helping provide empirical results, which I think are interesting and that they can inform normative conversations. But I do think that they have to live in dialogue. Like to me, science is digging a tunnel in which one side you have theory and the other side you have empirics, and science is the point in which the two meet. So I wouldn't kind of like think that like neither camp ever is gonna win. You only win when science makes dialogue between empirics and theory possible.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I didn't mention in the introduction is your works in the visual arts as well. This the biodigital sci-fi virtual reality story, and also this self-directed, self-shot documentary, In My Shoes. I saw the letter and I thought it was very interesting. I think it's a very interesting, let's say, summary of a researcher's life to be shown also for people who are interested in having a research career. And that was shot in a few months of your life in 2016. I was wondering how would In My Shoes be if shot in 2020?
No, yeah, I think, of course, my daughter would be older, and it would be a lot of home shots because of the pandemic. But I think it's a little bit different. On the one hand, like, once the pandemic came, I was happy to have like already seen the world. So I done more than 1 million miles, and I've been to China, to Kazakhstan, to like all parts of the world like several times. So that I think was good, and it helped me meet a lot of people and learn about a lot of different cultures, because you cannot learn about other people just through media or just through technology. You need to be there and be kind of like immersed in the environment to start understanding how people behave, how they react. There's a lot of like tacitness on culture that you need to travel to absorb. I wish there's gonna be a time in which I'm gonna be able to travel again, but I'm okay being hyper local right now, because I had like planophobia by the end, so I think now would be like much more of a domestic show, and maybe it wouldn't be as interesting in terms of traveling, but I think there is an interesting episode right now because I just moved to Europe a few weeks ago, and I had to set up a new team, and I'm like learning how things work in France, which is very different than the way that they work in the US, so I think that is something that is definitely, there's some comedy potential, and always things and complexity. I tend to see life as a comedy in any case, so there's always complexity.
Yeah, that's the implicit question, right? I know that you just moved to France, and I was wondering, how do you see this next chapter of your life, and being somehow in Manchester at Harvard and at Toulouse, in this world in which we have to play by these new rules. I told you I'm in a kind of similar situation. So how
honestly, like Europe has a lot of great things. At this age, you know, I don't party, so my life is, you know, like you work, you have a home life, you go to sleep, you eat, and you go for a walk. You know, and Toulouse has a much better walk, you know, than where I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So in that context, you know, I think that's nice. The food is nice. The people seem kind of like friendly. You know, it seems kind of like smaller. Like people kind of like turn around when they hear someone speaking English. While in the US, people are very used to, especially in a place like Cambridge, to people speaking every language everywhere. You know, because for example, Cambridge, Massachusetts is like 35-40% foreign born. So it's a lot of turnover and a lot of like different people. But I'm hoping to make it work in Europe. You know, like so. I have a little bit of runway to start a small group. You know, I'm going to start applying for funding, and I hope I can build something here, because I think Europe has a lot of good things, has a lot of good people, but has failed to have in the recent decades the same type of cultural and scientific impact than the US. I think in part there's like a few things, like for instance, you know, people here don't know about marketing, you know, and that's something that is really important, and it's not easy. You know, but you need to know how to do, because at the end, you know, scientific work is about producing content and also delivering. And if you produce content and you don't get to the people that content is valuable for, you know, then the work is not complete. And the people that you want to target and that you want to reach with your content can be in very different places, both in academia and in the private sector and in government. And you need to know how to get your content out there and so forth. I think Europe has not been that good at that too, you know, and there are other things that I think I can probably contribute. So I bring kind of like a lot of experience from the US of how things work at MIT, at Harvard, and I'm learning how things work here, and I'm hoping that this transfer of knowledge can help, you know, enrich me by learning things from here, but also enrich, you know, in this case, the University of Toulouse, which is the environment that I'm going to be at.
I think that's an interesting point. It reminds me of a very interesting point you make in how information grows, that knowledge is in the links, in a sense, right? It's dispersed in the networks. And that's why it's very hard to transplant a network to another place. You make this case of Silicon Valley or Hollywood, even if you hire the same people, it would be very hard to have the same effect in other places, because it's diffused in that sense. So I was wondering, what are the links which are missing here in Europe that we were not able to replicate, in a sense, what you just mentioned that we see in the US?
Yeah, I do see kind of like I think it's very early for me, but just the speed at which people answer emails, it's like a completely different thing. You know, like here is kind of like email is kind of like a weekly phenomena, and in the US it's kind of like an hourly phenomena. So there are kind of like some differences, I think, in the speed at which people move. I think like the internet and social media here seem a little bit more of a foreign thing, you know, and there's good and bad to that. You know, I think, you know, because social media also can be very invasive and stressful and addictive and whatnot. Yeah, and I think the institutions, I think, are a little bit different too. You know, I'm starting to learn that, like in Europe, like they like to give kind of like these awards in research that go to like 45 PIs or 30 PIs, and everybody gets a little bit, and those are huge coordination costs. And I think in the US it is based more on groups that have fewer leaders and then teams behind them, you know, and I think there is value on that type of leadership, you know, in science, because otherwise, you know, if you want, like sometimes I see projects, like I was asked to like be, for example, an advisor of a project, and it's a big project, 10 million euros, so it's a lot of taxpayer money there, and they're gonna build kind of like a platform for COVID and the economic recovery. But then you look that there's 30 professors and it's 3 years. So basically every professor is getting one PhD student for 3 years. They're not going to build shit, you know, I guarantee it, you know, because to build something, you need at least a team of 4 or 5 people dedicated only to that, working only on that as a priority. So it would be cheaper, you know, but you have to award it to like a team that can dedicate itself to that and has the knowledge, instead of like dispersing a little bit for everyone, which I see kind of like is a funding model that sometimes get proposed here. So I'm starting to see kind of differences, and of course I'm going to keep on learning the more I go. But these are the ones that like struck me, off the bat.
I see that, this last point reminds me of another discussion that you address on your work, which is the comparison between meritocracy and topocracies in networks, right? So it seems that, I like it very much, and I like the case that you make that, full, let's say, meritocratical networks will have to be quite small in size, right? Calculated by the square of the number and so on. But one thing that it's related to this discussion we're having now on how to fund research and if you concentrate research or not and so on. I was wondering, because I had the impression that in the way you phrase it, or in the maybe it's the wrong impression, you would put these two things as mutually exclusive, right? So in most networks which are bigger than this very small size, it's location. But don't you think that location is it's a product of capacity as well, or merit, or whatever we value in that system? And it's not completely arbitrary, and typically not just based on power and politics, but also on capacity. So the two views could be reconciled in a sense.
Help me understand a little bit more, because of course there is a continuum and there is a crossover at that square of the Dunbar number, but what do you mean about like location and capacity? I don't think I
no. I mean, so in the idea of a topocratic network, I mean how you are connected. So this central mediating hubs would make a lot of difference, right? So depending on where you are in the network, would predict somehow your success, right? But where you are on the network, your location and your connections on the network is derived from capacity as well, and not only on luck or politics, on power and so on. So in a sense, these ideas that topocratic networks can also be meritocratic. That's what I mean.
Yeah, so I do agree, to that, of course, with some caveats or so like in some way, I do think that people that are capable in certain ways, become more connected, become more central, more people get to know their work and they connect to them and all of that. But you do have like notable exceptions, and even as a person that becomes connected, you start kind of like to realize that, that there's some people that are more like, coordinators, and other people that are better at kind of like sometimes focusing on one thing. One great example in that case would be like, Van Gogh was a very disconnected person throughout his life, and his brother Theo was the one that was connected, and eventually, like if it wasn't for Theo, Van Gogh's work probably would not have been known, So you had kind of like a central actor, and you had a very peripheral actor that produced a lot of value by today's standard, based on like how those paintings were sold as well. Like a little bit like a Wozniak and Jobs type of idea too, Jobs was the one that orchestrated and connected and was able to kind of like understand how the different social pieces went together, but you need someone like Wozniak to do the engineering, and figure those things out, even though Jobs ended up being much more connected than Wozniak in some way. And you see that duality too, like the other example that
again talking about sorry.
Yeah, it's Disney and iWorks. So Walt Disney, he knew how to draw and everything, but the designer of Mickey Mouse is a guy called Ube Iwerks, who was kind of like the partner of Disney, and he worked with him and with, through from the very beginning, and he was the real, designer and drawer, of the cartoons, and the one that kind of like led that, while Disney was the one that had kind of like more like the vision and the larger ideas. And so I do think, like in combination, when you have kind of like a great creator and a great connector, you do great, because I don't think that great connectors are always great creators. There might be a correlation that your creative work allows you to attract fame and to connect, but I do see also some, not a difference in capacity, but a trade-off in that time is finite. So the more I focus on doing events and talks and connecting to people, the more people I know, the less I can write. The more I write, the less I can do events, So that time trade-off, I do think is very real,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, talking about this collaborative networks, and I mean, I think in my shoes is about that in the end, right? It's about scientific networks and collaboration scientific networks, and the role of networks on that. So if we take something like what we're experiencing now, COVID, and another interesting point you make is that the computing power of networks depends on the complexity and size of the networks, and that it's grounded on trust, on levels of trust.
Yeah.
Right? So to deal with a problem, I mean, we are experiencing this now. To deal with a problem like this, to solve something like COVID, we would have to collaborate on a massive network. And really, this would be predicated on really high levels of trust, which is something which seems to be missing there. Not only because, it's not only collaboration among scientists, but whatever politicians do will, be reflected in what people do and feedback and so on. So how, and we see in this example, very low levels of trust on politicians. Right, from the general public on politicians, from the general public on scientists, but also on data, on the sharing of data and data that comes from different countries and data quality and so on. So I guess the question is, how can we collaborate globally to address severe problems like the one we're facing now, when at the same time we seem to be living in a crisis of trust?
Yeah. No, yeah, it's hard because trust at the end modulates the way that you react to kind of like a stranger in a way, because there's some people that you already know and you know where to trust them or not for good or bad, But like one thing that I've learned is that as I do content and you release content, sometimes the content becomes very popular and you experience kind of like your 15 minutes of fame, And when I've had experience in which I've produced content that has gone viral or that has become widely adopted, very quickly then you start seeing like a bunch of people that never met you and don't know you and didn't even see the content start kind of like having very negative opinions about you, like for whatever like reason and so forth. And I think to me it reflects like, yes, to them, I'm kind of like this random person that all of a sudden appears in kind of like some sort of news or newsfeed, and who the heck is this guy? And I don't trust new people. Everybody that is kind of like saying something is probably trying to get something out of me or whatever, and they're very suspicious. They have low levels of trust. And I think that limits a lot the ability of solutions and things to scale nowadays, Like in some sense, we scale much more through common critique than through common support, Like there's like the things like supporting each other in initiatives, like it's really hard and those networks are really small, and people that are against something that are huge networks, Like basically, sometimes what unites the left and the right more than their shared values is their shared hate for each other,
Mm-hmm.
And that I think it's a very dangerous situation, because you do need ideas and initiatives to scale, even if they're half baked. Like the way that ideas grow is that no idea is fully baked from the beginning, but if you kill them, they're not allowed to grow, they're not allowed to improve. And that's why I think also, we're having, problems in this space. It's hard to find that collaboration, and you see it in Brazil, I see it in Chile, we see it in the US, and we see it in different parts of the world, with the exception of China, in which, despite the fact that people in the West, think of China from a certain perspective, I visited China multiple times. People in China love their government and they respect it and they trust it a lot, So China has government approvals that are very high compared to that of Western democracies. And I think that influences in that people believe that the government is run by professionals, that if they ask them to do something or they put a protocol in place, it was done by people that were responsible and they knew what they were doing. And here, even when people know what they were doing, half of the population is going to, treat that solution as coming from some idiots, simply because everything that, this party or those people say are idiots. So I am worried about that situation too, but I don't know how to solve it, of course. I think we're kind of like in a very delicate situation. I do think that it's more structural. I don't think this is something that is going to just simply flip. And I think it has to do in part that I don't think democracy, as we have it, it's a solution that works very well for large locations. So democracy works great in Uruguay, it's great in New Zealand. Yeah. It's crap for a place like Brazil and the United States, especially these representative forms of democracy in which you give so much power to one person in a very episodic election. I think in Uruguay, I was there in November. I had dinner, like 1 week before the election, and sitting next to me was a guy that was, a minister of the interior of the current government, and another guy that had been a presidential candidate of the opposition party, and they're there having dinner. In the US, you would never have someone have dinner, with, let's say Mike Pence and, Bill Clinton. It would be like a really weird dinner, that both of them would be, 1 week before the election. It would be impossible. The country is like too far. And in Uruguay, no, everybody that is in politics in the left and the right, they went to school together, they play soccer together, they know each other, their kids are friends, whatever. And in those places that are smaller, democracy is able to scale at 3 million people, maybe 5 million people. Once you get larger, the game is different, and it's a game just of telling, like trying to show that the other person is a bad person of moral character, because as we saw in the book, people judge human by their intentions. So it's all a game of convincing that the other candidate has bad intentions. Whether it is QAnon trying to say that the Democrats are pedophiles. What is the Democrats try kind of like to talk trash about the Republicans, whether they're right or wrong. Like, the point is that the game is not a game of ideas and what we should do together. It's a game of why the other one should not be trusted, and that's a game that doesn't end well. Ends up with not trusting anyone.
That's a very interesting point. That you end the book, How Humans Judge Machines, with this passage that connects your TED talk, right? So you say, humans judge machines by their intentions. Sorry, humans judge humans by their intentions and machines by their outcomes. And as we move to a different form of democracy, of direct democracy or digital democracy, we can move to a model that is more based on outcomes, provided that we can agree on the outcomes and how to measure them, right? I think that's the quote. So I have two questions about that. One is, can we agree on the outcomes, especially if we, because the outcomes are not just based on facts, right? They are based on values and they're based on emotions. So in a sense, and I think this is a point made by Harari, that we are not asking people what they think, but how they feel when they go to vote, right? So it's about emotions, and that's something that Jonathan Haidt would recognize as well, right? Yes. That we have different values and different sensitivities. So the first question is, can we ever agree on values? Yeah. So that we can agree on outcomes?
I don't think we can fully agree on all values, but I do think that when we look across the board, there are some values, that are quite universal, and I don't think they are from the left and the right. And because they're universal and because we agree on, we never talk about them and we never build on them. So, for example, I think that people in the left and the right agree that children are entitled to a good childhood. I don't think that people would generally disagree to that. I think children are entitled to a good childhood that has probably 99% approval, as something that you can say, and there are shared things like that. The problem is that, and what we've looked, for example, what we're starting to see with the things that we did last year with Chilecracy and Lebanocracy and these platforms that we did for political participation, is that political systems tend to focus on what's controversial rather than on what things people agree on, So the things that people disagree on are the ones that get ignited in social media, get ignited in the conversation and become topics of discussion. And the things that people agree on, since everybody agree on, nobody fights, they die down and they do not become a conversation. They do not become a discussion or a fight. So I do think that there's some things that we can probably agree on, and I think the most difficult one then would be, on how to agree on how to choose or learn those outcomes, because values change over time, and we learn them, the way that people thought about a lot of things 30 years ago and today is very different. And people have some trouble admitting that sometimes, but it's true. It is very different, and we're learning, and as we're learning, we have to understand that these systems do not follow fixed objective functions. We follow objective functions that are eternally changing. And that is true in AI. That's true for humans. We're always figuring out what I want to do next, what I want my life to be, So figuring out how to agree on those changing outcomes, those changing preferences, I think is part of the challenge, or how to have ways of collecting that information. That's why I do think that it's important to get there, to have forms of participation that are less episodic than the ones that we have today, and to have higher frequency forms of democracy, in which we don't have one vote every 4 years if you're lucky, because I'm 40, I had 3 chances to vote for president because I moved to the US, so I couldn't vote as a foreign. Now I'm in France, I cannot vote. In some sense, democracy is something that happens once every 7 years for me. It's extremely episodic, and something at that frequency cannot keep anyone accountable. So if you have something that is more frequent, higher frequency, I do think we might have ways to learn on those outcomes and have a discussion that once again is focused on what we want rather than why we shouldn't trust other people.
No, I think it's a very nice view. I'm definitely not a pessimistic. You propose in the STAT talk this idea of a software age-based democracy. I like it very much. One issue that strikes me as particularly difficult there is the issue of, we discussed this issue of sharing values, but also having a good, precise semantic understanding of what is at stake, right? So if we put an AI system to understand people's intentions on one hand, and to understand the content, the semantic content of bills, for example, on the other hand, there are so many important issues there, right? So, for example, I don't know if you know, this example comes from Steven Pinker on the language instinct. This example of the World Trade Center, if there were one event or 2 events which happened on that day, and this was subject to a legal dispute for 10 years. So people are trying to decide right? You probably know the example. So the issue there is not that this is something that it's based on a kind of a prioristic definition of events, right? So we have to have the common sense knowledge that we were talking about just now, this kind of ways for a machine to really understand the content of what's written there. And that seems to go in the opposite direction of this number crunch obsessed approach that we are taking with AI right now, right? When you have different bills produced by different people in different points in time in a kind of distributed system, how to make sense of the semantic content of that?
So I do believe that to get technology to work, one of the things that is really important at the end of the day, more than the technology itself many times, is the UI, UX, the interaction, and all of that. So if you take a normal bill produced by any legislative body across the world, most people don't understand what the heck it means, So it's not kind of like that, it's going to be difficult for machines to understand. It's difficult for an educated person that didn't study law to understand, because it is very technical. So I don't think we can assume to have, systems built on technology and AI using those representations. We're going to need to change those representations, and we need to figure out how to have a user interface, and a codification of, laws or regulations, that is more machine readable, more machine amenable, and more, amenable to people's participation as well, And I think that's a big part of the challenge, because if you try to put technology as a layer on top of what we have right now, I don't think it's going to interface well, But if you think that you can start defining, laws and legal language in a way that is more similar to, machine rules, I think we can do better. And there are things that tell us why this might be important. So, for example, recently in computer science, there has been a lot of work on fairness. Okay, Well,
Yeah.
like in a law nowadays, you could say, we demand the system to be fair and equitable for all parties involved, or some sort of natural language like that. But when push comes to shove and you need to implement that, you need to choose some definition of fairness. And the truth is that computationally you can have dozens of definitions of fairness. Equality of opportunity, statistical parity, equality of false rejections, whatever. So you can have all of those different things, but by trying to encode those into code and mathematics, people have discovered all of those definitions and now understand them. Now we know them. So well, it might be clearer to start thinking things in those terms, in how kind of like we can create things that are more precise, more machine readable, more amenable to some like a higher level of understanding, both by machines and humans, because I think what we have right now sometimes is not very understandable by humans in many cases, and we have like a whole system built on interpreting those laws around us, that has all of its games and things. And there's something positive to also having an interpretative layer too. Don't get me wrong about that, but I do think that, to your question, this would require adapting. Like, how would you build that user interface? Those interactions, those representations. All of that would have to adapt. And I think that's kind of the interesting challenges.
Yeah, and I think it also highlights the importance of this kind of conceptual clarification work on defining these explicit theories of fairness, of trustworthiness, and so on, so such that we can render transparent in a sense, right? These different models so that people can know what's going on, I guess.
How conceptual modelers may help to clarify the world of AI? Do you think there is a space for contribution? What do you mean by conceptual modelers?
I think it has to do with what we just discussed. I mean, this idea of doing conceptual work and conceptual clarification, for example, on all these different notions like trustworthiness and fairness and so on.
Oh, right? I think that's huge, and I do think that in the world of like human machine interactions or technology and society, like even like work of fiction sometimes can be very clarifying and inspiring. Like if there is this whole area also called design fictions, which is about like imagining that some near future technology is available and try to think about like potential implications, and I think that pushes you to think more clearly about concepts, pitfalls, implications, all of that. So the idea that computer science and engineering are disciplines that are meager in ethics, I would partly agree on that. I don't think so. I've talked with a lot of people that are very high up in big companies working on AI, and they're very careful at thinking about a lot of these topics, because they're smart, very educated people that actually understand that these things are important. So the idea that these are people that like these algorithms are done by people that are just pressing keys to build code, it's a caricature. It's not reality. That said, the idea that these machines are being programmed by programmers and therefore they're doing that programmers are telling them to do, it's also another misunderstanding, because that's not how machine learning works. If you build a mechanical deterministic machine, sure, the person that designed the machine programmed the behaviors. But when you do machine learning, you basically develop algorithms that learn from data, and the same algorithm training different data is going to have a different outcome. So who are you going to blame? The data? Are you going to blame the programmer? Well, the experience that the algorithm has changes the behavior. So in some way, like saying that this is a machine that is programmed by a programmer and behaves like the programmer programmed it, is thinking about traditional computing, not machine learning. And I think that shows another conceptual mistake. So I do think that, yeah, programmers and developers, should have education in ethics and should explore about these topics. But honestly, I see more interesting papers on ethics of AI coming out from the computer science and AI community than from the philosophy community, because unlike philosophers, computer scientists and engineers are engaging with data, are testing their hypotheses, and are doing a lot of things. So I think this comment, sorry, Bernhard, I think it has two big misconceptions. One it's a caricature of computer scientists and engineers. This is not, these people that don't understand or are meager in ethics. Actually, some of the more interesting work on the field right now is coming from there. And two, that AI, it's behaviors programmed by programmers. That's not true. It's the concept of machine learning is that the machine learns, through experience and through data. So the same algorithm is going to give very different outcomes depending on the data that it consumes.
Mm-hmm. If it happens that the group that is assigned to the machine condition does happen to have a lower overall tendency to trust by coincidence than the group assigned to the human condition, the comparison would not be fair, as an example.
Okay, but no, but it's a randomized experiment. So the people assigned to each group is random. So if there's a person that has a lower tendency to trust, has the same probability of being assigned to the treatment and the control. And then we check that the groups are balanced. So no, yeah, it's a randomized experiment. So it's not like two groups that we define, and the whole point of experiment is to avoid selection bias. When using technology AI into business process, one would have other dimensions other than moral that are related to business goal. I would like to know how you believe things change when you have to achieve business goal and some decisions go against ethics or morals. That's a hard question to answer in general, because, like you can imagine a million scenarios in that space that are very different. Could be, someone trying to reduce the cost of a car, and trading off with some security, so that could be one, business goal vis-a-vis ethics, and it could be very different from, another business decision. Let's say, you're doing a recommended algorithm in social media, and, the algorithm ends up reinforcing, like, I don't know, like children watching, certain violent cartoons. There's so much on that space that, of course, you want to kind of like have an ethical behavior, but how that trades off against business goals in general, I think that's an interesting question of study. But for that, you will need to unpack it into a lot of different experiments, because there's potentially a lot of different cases and a lot of nuance, in that question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think I'll let you go. It's
okay. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the generosity of giving this talk and answering all these questions. It was really great to have you here, and I think it was a great way to close this series of talks. Thank you very much again. So we come to an end of EROSS. So we've been together here for this 20 weeks. I would like again to thank you very much for attending these talks and asking all these great questions, and to thank again my the whole team here, Enrico and Claudenir and Tiago, for doing really great supporting work. We decided to do this in the last minute. It's being very we were improvising most of the time. But it was really a silver line on this whole process of being locked in for the entire summer. And it was great. It was a pleasure for me as well. It is a lot of work, but it was really great talking to all these people, to these 20 different people throughout the entire summer. So I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for being here. And, I hope in the future, we're going to have a second edition of EROSS maybe next year. Thanks a lot. Enjoy ER. Starting tomorrow, and stay safe. Bye.